Hi, we're going to be talking quite a bit about Christian Platonism in this course. We're going to be thinking about a variety of authors who write within the Platonic tradition. It's going to start actually before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth and continue at least through St. Anselm. So there's going to be a significant train of thought that is centered around a certain interpretation, a certain embellishment of the Platonic system. What I want to talk about today is some aspects of that Platonic tradition so that we can understand where a variety of these authors are coming from. The authors are going to include such figures as Philo of Alexandria, also known as Philo Judaeus, Augustine, and Anselm. So we're going to be thinking about a variety of figures who take Plato's basic insights and then use them in a Christian context to give a philosophical foundation for Christianity. But today I want to just talk about Plato himself. I want to talk about the problem that the Platonic system faces, and also the problems that Plato introduces his theory of forms to solve. So let's start with a theory of forms and trying to understand why Plato introduces it in the first place. What is it doing, and why, once you start questioning certain aspects of it, do you land back into skepticism? So let's begin. Maybe the most famous move in all of Plato is the introduction of forms. It happens in books 6 and 7 of the Republic. Plato begins to talk about these forms, these ideas that are abstract, not found in the world, but instead are something like the originals, of which everything else in the world is a copy. Now, at first glance, you might think that's a very weird sort of view. You mean my hand is really just, well, some kind of shadow of some original handiness? That seems odd. Or my shirt is somehow just an imitation of the shirt, the form of the shirt? Well, as one can see if one examines Plato's theory in detail, maybe not everything has a form, but still, that's the central idea. The things we find in the world are really just shadows or reflections or images or copies in some way inferior to the original form. And so there is this realm of forms, Platonic heaven, that is not found in the world. And so at first glance you could think, this guy's thought to be a great philosopher. Why does he do it? Well, he does it for very good reasons. And so let me try to explain the dynamic that leads him there. It's something that Plato himself does not really explain very directly in the Republic, though once you see what's going on in the debates about justice between, for example, Socrates and Thrasymachus, you start to see the general kind of problem that the theory of forms is ultimately supposed to solve. Imagine initially that we have two people, and those people are, let's say, debating justice, just like Socrates and Thrasymachus at the beginning of the Republic. Well, here we could draw one of them, and here's the other. Maybe I should draw them in togas or whatever Greek philosophers would have worn. In any case, let's just call them for the moment A and B. And they're debating questions of justice. So here one of them uses the word just, and so does the other. They're talking about what is just, what it is to be just as well. Now, we might wonder whether they're actually using the term the same way, whether we've got one sense of justice here, or whether actually they mean different things. They might be disagreeing because they just mean different things. Well, how do we know what they mean? Now, there are a variety of ways in which we might approach the question of linguistic meaning, but the way that Plato and Aristotle and a variety of people in the tradition this far think about it, they think of it as a matter of, well, what these people have in mind. So imagine here that we have the mind of A, and here we've got the mind of B, and we've got some notion of what is just, or justice there. I'm going to write that simply as a J, and understand that as their concept of justice. So the thought is that the word in some way ties in to that concept. Now, the issue in a sense is whether the words have the same meaning and whether those are the same concepts. So I'm going to write this one simply as J, and here we'll write J star to indicate that maybe that's the same, maybe that's different. We don't want to presuppose it at the outset. And so maybe these words are being used with the same sense, maybe they're being used in different senses. Now, I've approached this from the point of view of the use of language, with us listening to the discussion between Thrasymachus and Socrates, for example, but it is not essential that we think of this in linguistic terms at all. We might just think in terms of what they're thinking. And are they thinking the same thought when they think that something is just? Well, that problem is one that we can confront now in a variety of settings. Here I'm imagining that A and B are different people. And so the issue that emerges there, if they're different people, is in part an issue of communication. Are they really communicating? Are they meaning the same thing? And it's also related to then a question of understanding. Does Thrasymachus understand what Socrates is talking about? Does Socrates understand what Thrasymachus is talking about? So we might think, are these words meaning the same thing? So meaning is also at stake here. And of course, if we think of them as referring to certain things, just is the sort of predicate that maybe doesn't refer to any particular thing, but it might be a word that actually is a referring expression, and so reference is also at stake here. We might worry, are they referring to the same thing? Are they meaning the same thing? Are they actually communicating? Are they understanding one another? But now as soon as we think about that, we realize, well, A and B don't actually have to be different people here. It might be that B is just, well, A at a different time. Okay? And so it might be, for example, that Socrates talks about justice today and Socrates talks about justice tomorrow. Does he mean the same thing? Is his concept the same? Maybe he's reflected further on it and the concept has changed. And so we can worry then not only about communication or understanding, about meaning and about reference, but also about the continuity of thinking. We might worry that actually, because the meaning can shift over time and the concept can change over time, maybe we've got a question of just rational thought and the continuity of thought. Can we think about anything in a continuous fashion? Can it stay the same thing? Maybe, just as Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice. Maybe you can't step into the same river of thought twice. Maybe you can't think the same thought twice. And if that's true, maybe you can't even invoke the same concept twice. How do you actually engage in any reasoning at all? How do you think about anything for longer than a moment? Anyway, it's a scary prospect. Maybe the very coherence of thought is at issue. And then we could think, well, what if it's not a different person B, but really just A in a different possible world? A under different circumstances. So does Socrates mean the same thing he would mean, not just a day later, but if something were different? Suppose it were raining instead of sunny. Does that mean Socrates would have a different concept? At first glance, you might say, well, no, wouldn't mean that at all. But we might think about other things that might be more relevant, and so we might worry that what Socrates' concept of justice is might vary with who he's talking to, for example, or the particular context that it's being discussed in. In fact, that's not an absurd idea at all, to think that people mobilize different concepts of justice in different contexts. So, if you don't like possible world talk, think of this as just different circumstances or different contexts. How can we be sure that it's the same concept from one context to another? How can we be sure that it's the same concept from one situation to another? And now, finally, this might just be A himself. It might be that A is simply reflecting on A's own meaning, on A's own reference. And indeed, you can see something like that going on in many of the early dialogues of Plato. You've got somebody like Laches on courage, for example, who proposes various definitions in response to Socratic questioning, and then at a certain point just says, look, I guess I don't know what courage is. And he has a struggle trying to express what he means. He said, I have the feeling I know what I mean, but I can't say it. And maybe in the end, I don't even know what my concept of courage is. Maybe I don't know what I mean by courage. And so it may be somebody reflecting on their own usage of the term just, realizing, you know what, I don't understand myself. I don't actually know what my concept is. There are two questions here, really. Do I know what it is? And then if I do, can I articulate that? Can I say it? Well, put aside the question of can I say it or can I define it? Just think about the question of whether I even know what my concept is and what I can understand about my own meaning, about my own reference, about the content of my own concepts. So indeed, the question of content here. And there's a question of self-knowledge. It's not just a question of can I know what someone else means? Can I know even what I mean by something? Can I know what my own concepts are and what their content is? Well now, suppose we want to take a certain attitude about this and we say, look, those are really, really serious problems. In fact, I don't see how to solve this. I think, especially when we're talking about other people, but really once you come to it, even when I think about myself, I'm not sure what my own concept of justice is. And I certainly don't know what your concept of justice is. So do I know whether we're even talking about the same thing in talking about justice? And of course, it's not just about justice that this arises. It could be anything. Normative terms like justice or courage or friendship and so on, those are especially vulnerable to this. But on the other hand, it might be the same thing if you're just talking about a sandwich. Is a hot dog a sandwich? One person might say, no, well, I guess so. And another might say, no, that's not a sandwich, that's another kind of thing. Some people might even say a taco is a sandwich. Others are going to say, no, it's not a sandwich, that's ridiculous. So, in short, even on things as everyday as sandwiches, we might think, you know what? We don't really have a very clear concept. Even I am not sure whether I would count certain kinds of things as sandwiches or not. And so I might worry that I don't even know the content of my own concept. But that means I don't really know the content of my own thoughts. And if that's true, well, what am I doing in engaging in thinking at all? So we might worry that in fact we don't. Okay, one conclusion here is to say these problems are really serious problems. Maybe I don't know what you mean, or I don't have any reason to be confident that you understand what I mean. Maybe I don't even understand what I mean. And from moment to moment, maybe I mean something different. I don't really have enough self-knowledge to know what the content of my own thoughts is. But if that's true, how can I think rationally at all? So rationality is also an issue here. Now, one response to this, then, is the response of one of Plato's most profound opponents, the Skeptic. So the Skeptic says, look, can't do it. I can't, in fact, communicate. I can't understand what you mean. You can't understand what I mean. In fact, I don't understand what I mean. I have no reason to believe that anything I say or even think has any content at all. Certainly if it does, I don't know what it is, and so of course I can't expect you to know what it is. Now, some skeptics actually took this very seriously and took it so far as to say, well, that, I guess, means there's no point to thinking, there's no point to communicating, no point to saying anything. So the legend is told that Pyrrho, the skeptic par excellence, went so far as to stop speaking. Now, if you're my age and you simply stop speaking, what are the people around you going to think? What are your friends going to think? Well, Pyrrho's friends thought, perhaps he's going deaf and can't hear us. So they began to speak more loudly. Pyrrho! Well, Pyrrho got really annoyed with that. Then they started taking him to doctors. Like, maybe there's something wrong with him. He's lost his power of speech. Maybe he's had a stroke. Well, that didn't please Pyrrho either. So he started wagging his little finger to indicate, I heard you. Okay. But not only did he refuse then to participate in speech, and by the way, wagging the finger is kind of a cheat, because after all, he's assuming that he is communicating something by wagging the finger, like, I heard you. And so, really, I think that may be a move that undermines his entire attitude. His friends, anyway, had to pull him out of the path of chariots, keep him from getting injured, because he said, the evidence of my senses is no evidence at all that a chariot is actually coming down the street at me, or that I'm about to walk into a building or off a cliff. Well, presumably no one carries things quite that far. But there is a serious problem here. There's a real question about whether I can know what I mean, whether I can know what you mean, whether I can understand the content of my own speech and my own thinking. And sometimes we might really think that contexts matter, that my conception of justice in the family, for example, is different from my conception of justice in the state, or that my conception of justice in the seminar room is different from my conception of justice in everyday life. Lots of people espouse philosophical views and defend them in a philosophy classroom that they don't really live by. And indeed, skepticism is often one of those. There's a real question, as Miles Bernier once said, can the skeptic live his skepticism? David Hume at one point says, yes, I doubt whether there really is such a thing as necessary connection in the world, whether there are really causal relations. On the other hand, I leave the seminar room, I go play a game of billiards, and I don't raise those questions anymore. I simply hit the cue ball and assume that it will roll as a result and roll into other balls and move them. And in short, I take causation for granted. So, context might affect the way we're thinking, the way we're speaking, and what we mean, the content of our speech and thoughts, in a way that we don't really grasp or understand. So those things are important, and any adequate linguistic theory has to take into account the fact that context may indeed affect the content of what you say and think. But now let's return to the possibilities here. One possibility then is skepticism, to say you just can't do it. So it means we can't actually communicate, or at least know we're communicating. We can't know the contents of our own speech and our own thinking. There's another option. And that was a live option in the ancient world as well, among a school that was clearly opposed to Plato. That was the Sophists. The Sophists were relativists. So the Sophists say that, well, in discussing justice, there really isn't a question that we can disagree about. Socrates may have his conception of justice, Thrasymachus may have his, and so really we simply have justice for Socrates, justice for Thrasymachus. Or maybe we have justice in the seminar room and justice in everyday life. Maybe we have justice today, justice tomorrow. They're just different concepts. And we can talk about what is just and unjust for Socrates today, for example, but we can't really talk about what's just and unjust overall. So the debate is rather pointless. In the end, it's just like, let's agree to disagree. There's Socrates' version of justice, there's Thrasymachus' version of justice, and there is no such thing as justice for them to be disagreeing about. So here's the situation. The sophist traps each of us inside our own heads, and indeed inside our own heads in a given context at a given time. So here's the situation. The sophist traps us within our own heads. In fact, in our own heads at a given time, in a given context. So our ability to understand anything is very limited. Maybe, from that point of view, I can understand what I mean by something and what the contents of my own thoughts are, at least at this moment, but that's it. In fact, the moment I think a thought and then think, wait, do I understand the content of that thought? It's now another moment. And so it looks as if actually I can easily have this problem collapse into the skeptical position. The skeptical position is that I simply never know what I or anybody else means by anything, what the contents of our speech or our thought are. And so it looks as if I'm really at sea from the skeptical point of view, and I'm trapped on a tiny, tiny island from the sophist's point of view. Now, Plato thinks all this is absurd. In fact, he thinks it is possible to really debate about something when we debate whether something is just or unjust. He thinks it is possible for people to really disagree about what love means or what friendship is. They're not just trapped inside their own heads, and we can't just say, well, who knows, no way to tell, give up on it, don't worry about it. In fact, nobody knows what anybody thinks, including themselves, so it's all pointless, it's all irrational. He says, no, it's possible to think rationally about certain things. And if that's true, the skeptic and the relativist, the sophist, can't be right. But how can we explain why? He says there's only one way to do it. These concepts occur at a given time, in a given context, and moreover, these concepts are within individual people's minds. If there's something to debate about, if there really is a justice that we can disagree about, that people can have incomplete conceptions of and then learn more about, and so on, it's got to be something that is not like that. So in short, these are in the mind. We need some concept of justice. We need some justice itself that is now outside individual human minds. It has to be independent of particular times, and so it really has to be eternal. Moreover, it has to be independent of particular contexts. Now, maybe not independent of whether we're talking about justice in a family or justice among strangers. Maybe that's a relevant sort of context. But small changes in the world are not going to matter. It doesn't really matter whether it's rainy or it's sunny. It does not really matter how many clouds are in the sky. It doesn't really matter whether we're inside or outside. Justice is justice, and none of those things matter. If the cat suddenly uses the litter box in the middle of making the video, well, that shouldn't affect the meaning of the words in the video. And so, something has to be really modally stable. That is to say, it's not only going to hold in this exact context, given the way the world is, but it's got to hold across a wide region. So, extremely, if we take that far enough, we end up saying things that are true of it have to be true necessarily. It has to be, in some sense, necessary. At the very least, we could say it has to be modally stable. It has to be something that has a stable content across a wide region of variation in our current circumstances. Well, concepts in individual minds are certainly not like that. Meanings of linguistic expressions, well, may or may not be like that. But now, if the ultimate meaning of these terms is really referring not to my concept or your concept, but instead to justice, what justice is independently, then it's got to be outside our minds, it's got to be eternal, it's got to be necessary. Moreover, it can't be something found in the world. Things found in the world can change over time. They can be affected by circumstances. So it has to be outside the world. It has to be transcendent. Moreover, how many situations could be just? I don't mean how many situations in the world as it stands right now. I mean how many possible circumstances would we count as just? How many possible people could we count as being just people? It seems limitless, doesn't it? Surely infinitely many. There are infinitely many possible circumstances we might count as just. Infinitely many people we might count as just. So, this also has to be infinite. Well, that's what Plato introduces the forms to be. The forms are outside of individual human minds. They are eternal. They are necessary. They're transcendent. They're not found in space-time. They're not part of the world, in the causal relations of the world, at least of the ordinary ones, and they are infinite. Infinitely many possible situations or possible things might fall under them. Well, it's that abstract concept that I shouldn't say concept, that abstract form that my concept and your concept are in some way trying to capture. It's what our words are actually trying to refer to or to mean. And so justice is the thing we're really disagreeing about. Socrates and Thrasymachus are not debating the content of Socrates' idea or of Thrasymachus' idea or even the common Greek idea. They're talking about justice itself, and they're disagreeing about it. Moreover, they have concepts that are supposed to be concepts of justice itself. Now, they may be adequate to that, they may not be. However, they are trying to be concepts of justice, not of something else. So, when we look at things this way, we realize, this is Plato's middle ground. Plato says there are forms like this. Forms that are outside the realm of space-time. They give content to our thinking and to our speech. That's why there's something to disagree about. That's why we can be wrong about it. If Socrates means by justice, well, whatever would make the things Socrates says about justice true, then nobody can ever be wrong about anything. But that seems absurd. Of course people can be wrong about things. Okay, so that is Plato's solution. Plato says we reject the Sophist's position. We reject the Skeptic's position. It is possible to have something to disagree about. We can communicate because we're both communicating about justice. There is a continuity to my thinking. I can be thinking about justice. And in fact, I can be learning about it. I can be aware that my concept of justice is changing as I learn more about justice itself, about what it is to be just. That's the ultimate content of my thinking, and, at least ideally of my thinking, that is what gives my words meaning and reference. All of those things can be understood, and they can be understood independently of the particular person doing the thinking, doing the speaking. Now, within a generation, Plato's Academy became overwhelmingly skeptical. This solution didn't really hold over time. Why not? There's an obvious problem. We began asking the question, how do I know what you mean, or what your concept of justice is? We've ended up saying, but there's such a thing as justice itself, which is outside of our minds, that both of us are trying to capture. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're disagreeing about. But now, the skeptic can say, haven't you just introduced the same problem at a slightly different level? Now the question is, how do we know what justice itself is? You've got an idea of it, I've got an idea of it. Which one is actually capturing justice itself? How could we possibly know that? One way of thinking about it is that if this form is outside of space and time, then it's hard to see how it causally interacts with us. I can know something about this marker or about this whiteboard because I come into causal contact with them. I perceive them. But I don't perceive the forms. I may see a situation that I think is just or unjust, but I don't perceive the form of justice itself. And this has causal power. It can write on that board, can make a mark. But justice, does it have causal power? Justice itself, I mean, the justice outside of space and time? Maybe, but wow, we have to tell a story about that. And Plato, at this point, just gives us metaphors. In the Meno, he talks about recollection of justice itself. In the Republic, he talks about the form of the good, as in some way, like the sun, shedding light over the entire realm of forms. But those are metaphors. And so his students, and the students of his students, ended up saying, I don't get it. I don't see how this solves the problem at all. And of course, they were helped along in that by skeptics and sophists who said, I don't see how that solves the problem at all. So that sets the stage for later developments in Platonism. For several hundred years, Platonism fell out of favor as the skeptics emerged as victorious in these debates. But in the 1st century BC, Middle Platonism emerges, and it begins to address this and revive Plato's thinking by proposing some solutions to that skeptical problem.